There are many toxic relationships throughout the Breaking Bad franchise, which is to be expected as they create some of the best content out there. Saul's relationship with his brother Chuck just might be one of the best, or at least the best short-lived relationship, being that it only lasted for about 3 seasons. What makes this relationship differ from the others is Chuck's character, who is essentially the Skylar White of Better Call Saul, meaning that he is the most frustrating character to appear on screen. Comparing a character to Skylar White would normally shatter someone's interest in a show, but for Chuck's case, he is actually a phenomenally well-written character and is just as important to the plot. Our introduction to Chuck might lead someone to think that there wouldn't be such a dynamic between the two brothers, as Saul graciously supports Chuck by bringing him supplies from the outside world. In that first scene, we figure out that Chuck isn't an ordinary man, and it's later revealed that he believes he has electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which pretty much means he can feel nearby electricity and it hurts him. Of course, this isn't a real disorder and is actually just a mental disability, which becomes very important for later on. So what's really all that toxic between Saul and Chuck? Well, it's simple. Chuck chastises Saul for his shady sense of morals, and believes that he can never change his ways, though it also stems from a place of jealousy. Chuck becomes heavily manipulative and is dishonest with Jimmy, who struggles to get by without any real support, inevitably taking less honorable actions for income. The birth of toxicity. Chuck and Saul are both toxic characters, and end up putting each other through a lot of grief. What sets these two down their different paths stems back to their childhood, when Saul was a kid and Chuck was a teenager. As a child, Saul would take money out of the drawer from his father's store. Being a child, it's only natural to assume that Saul had no ill intentions and merely believed that he was only putting a dent in the family's income. His parents, of course, never put the blame on him, and so Saul continued to act in this way, unknowingly destroying his father's business. The only person to see through this act was his brother Chuck. Chuck wasn't just annoyed with Saul's actions, he was annoyed that his parents put him on such a pedestal. The attention was never put on Chuck, even though he later in life became a renowned lawyer. Even on his mother's deathbed, her final words didn't have anything to do with Chuck. She simply cried out for Jimmy, with a worried look on her face. Saul's parents treasured him too much, leading to an ignorant upbringing which caused his lust for scamming people. Because of that lack of discipline, Chuck blames the things that happened to their family on Saul. These events caused Chuck to play the prosecutor in Saul's life, putting it up to him to decide whether or not Saul was innocent, and also believing that his assessment was completely just. Chuck unintentionally put himself on his own pedestal as he determined whether or not Saul was ever good enough. Act 2. Becoming a lawyer was a way of redemption for Saul. In the later episodes of Season 1, we learned that Saul went under the alias of Slippin' Jimmy, where he and his friend Marco scammed people. It wasn't until Jimmy was arrested for a strange crime that Chuck came to his rescue and bailed him out of jail. He did so under the condition that Jimmy would change his ways. And that's what he did, though it seemed that the two had different ideas of redemption. Chuck didn't want Saul to become a lawyer because he didn't believe his heart was in the right place. He preferred to treat Saul like a pet and keep him in the mailroom of the law firm they worked at, which Chuck claims was a great place for Saul to be in. Though Saul thought of the mailroom as a placeholder job, something to do before he actually gets a purpose in life. And that purpose was the law, just like his older brother. While Saul was admiring his older brother, Chuck not only treated Saul like an inferior being, but even resented him the second he found out that Saul had passed the bar. By covering his true emotions with a smile, Chuck managed to manipulate and micromanage Saul's life through his friend, Harold Hamlin, so that Saul would never become a lawyer for their firm. This didn't stop Saul, however, as he opened up his own practice and took all kinds of clients. He humbly drove his car, which was on the verge of breaking down, to each client, remaining optimistic in all of his endeavors. Though due to a lack of support, Saul had no other choice but to act less honorably than others. It's not as if he doesn't try his best, as we see how he handles the Kettlemans. He chooses to warn them, instead of robbing their embezzled money and splitting it with Nacho Varga. He also chooses to return the money when he has Mike steal it, so that they would do the right thing. Saul worked around the clock, trying his best as a lawyer while also caring for Chuck, though Chuck doesn't really appreciate it at all, and instead keeps Saul in a miserable place. The ironic part of this is that Saul most likely wouldn't have made dicey decisions had Chuck been upfront with them during their whole lives. Instead, Chuck shut Jimmy out, and never gave him what he wanted most, which was brotherly love. Chuck's lawsuit. Chuck and Jimmy's ties are severed when Chuck outsmarts Jimmy by recording him confessing to tampering with legal documentation, which caused Chuck to lose the partnership with the Mesa Verde company. Saul doesn't take this lightly, of course. He breaks into Chuck's house and goes on a rampage drawn from intense stress. Unfortunately for Saul, Chuck planned and prepared for this, and has witnesses in his house. After such an intense scene, we see Saul on the side of the road waiting to be arrested. But before he leaves, his brother calmly tells him that he could wait inside, speaking to him as though every choice Saul makes is psychotic. Saul takes another drag of his cigarette before looking down at the asphalt, and says this to Chuck.
Here's what's gonna happen. One day you're gonna get sick. Again. One of your employees is gonna find you curled up in that space blanket, take you to the hospital, hook you up to those machines that beep and whir and hurt. And this time it'll be too much, and you will die there, alone.
Not once does Saul look at Chuck while giving his speech, as if the words are slipping out of his mouth against his will. Later in court, Chuck is asked if he loves his brother, in which he responds that he does, and that he isn't trying to hurt him. He claims that he cherishes the law, and that no one can be above it. He goes as far to say that Saul does not treat the law well, and in no way should be a lawyer. You can visibly see the disappointment in Saul's face from Chuck's words, which is not an uncommon expression to see. But whenever Saul's mood is diminished by Chuck, the expression is always much more solemn than it is by others. The only one who is able to recreate that expression might be Kim, but it's always Chuck who breaks Saul's heart. After Saul beats Chuck in the lawsuit, he speaks to Chuck in private at his home, which is at the end of the season and right before his death. Chuck smoothly tells Saul that he will never be any better, and that he didn't really love Saul all that much. It directly contradicts what he said to him earlier in the court case, and it's very clear where Chuck's true emotions stem from. Saul's tenaciousness and unwavering skills continuously cause him to land on his feet, which is exactly what Chuck despises most of all. It was the cherry on top to Chuck's spite for Saul to beat him in the courtroom, a place where Chuck is supposedly at his best. The only way Chuck can win in some way after being defeated so viciously by Jimmy is by getting into his head, which he can always do so easily. Chuck's parting words to Jimmy cause a ripple effect over the next 2 seasons, causing Jimmy to drift away and dive into his new alter ego, Saul Goodman. Where Jimmy would stop and decline a case, Saul Goodman would look the other way and take cash from under the table. At the end of the day, Chuck is a byproduct of Saul's painful ignorance that shined as a child, while Saul is a byproduct of his brother's disdain for him, as well as his excessive manipulativeness. It's quite clear that these two are brothers, as they both resemble a lot of these quirks, though it's also clear that because of a few differences in their past, they become very different people. Chuck's ego and arrogance leads him to believe that there is no way his brother can be as good as him, while Saul's easy upbringing led him to a dead end, resulting in a narcissistic mindset where he believes that the whole world is out to get him. Saul definitely isn't as bad a person as Chuck makes him out to be, or at least earlier in the show he isn't. But because of their relationship, it's quite clear to us now that at the end of the series, Chuck was the one who kept pushing Saul down the path he took, even if he didn't mean to intentionally. Is one of them more toxic than the other? Personally, I'd argue that Chuck is worse, though it doesn't help that he has substantially less screen time than Saul. Chuck's flaws derive from ego, which is similar to Walt from Breaking Bad. But let's be honest, Chuck is annoying. He always was the first person in the room to be so manipulative and rude, which is probably why we hate him so much. And since it's so obvious that Chuck's character birthed Saul Goodman, it's easy to blame everything that Saul does on Chuck. Anyway, that'll be all. Bye.